Hi friends, welcome to today's video. My name's Stephanie and today we're looking at Olive's newest collection for spring called Equinox. So this collection features 6 brand new shades in a maybe familiar color story, but don't worry, as always, I will have comparisons at the end as well as my thoughts on this collection. But for now, let's just get into the swatches. First up, we have Scape, which is a pastel leaf green cream inspired by garlic scapes, one of the first spring produce of the year. So the formula on this one was really nice and easy to apply, very typical and expected for Olive polishes, but I did notice it was a little bit thinner and almost on the crully side, which is kind of what we'll see with the rest of the collection as well. This one, though, became fully opaque for me in just 2 coats. And I absolutely adore this shade of green. I think it is so perfect for the season, and I just can't wait to show you all the comparisons for this shade, but this is probably one of my favorite ones. Next up, we have Amaryllis, which is a peachy pink cream. So I found the formula on this one was a little bit thinner than the last shade, so it leaned even more on the crelly side, but it kind of reminded me of Zinc from the Pigment collection, if you're familiar. I managed to get this one opaque for me in 2 coats, but I could see this one needing a 3rd, especially if you just prefer doing thinner coats. But yeah, formula aside, I think this color is just so pretty. I feel like it's a really great mix of a playful kind of pink shade, but it's still a little bit romantic as well. This one is obviously inspired by pink amaryllis flowers, which I think are so beautiful. The next shade we have is Elwell, which is this dainty, almost icy lavender kind of shade with a pinkish shimmer. And this is inspired by the first blossoms on trees in early spring. Since this is the lightest shade, it definitely had the sheerest formula, but sadly I didn't find this one to self-level really well for me, so I personally don't think this is one of those shades that could look nice on one coat unless you're really careful with your application. But it does end up having this really beautiful milkiness on 2 coats because the color evens out without becoming fully opaque. Like, you can just barely make out my nail line in certain angles, but I do think it is a lot more wearable like this if you really do like that soft, crelly kind of look. But I did decide to build this up to opacity with a slightly thicker 3rd coat, and oh my gosh, I just love how bright and refreshing this shade is. I think this is such a perfect shade to transition from the cold winter months to the bright, colorful spring shades. My only gripe is that the shimmer is a little bit hard to make out, but you do get the sense that it's there and that this isn't just a cream polish, if that makes sense. So it almost has this certain glow to it, and I really love that. Next up we have Artie, and this is described as a muted purple cream with gray undertones. The name of this one was inspired by Walker's first fur baby, who was adopted in early spring. So formula-wise, this was pretty similar to the first 2 shades, where it was a little bit thin but built up to opacity in just 2 coats for me, and it was really easy to work with as well. So I think this one is such a pretty shade, even if it is kind of that typical dusty spring pastel purple. There is still a certain brightness to it that I think makes it work really nicely for spring and isn't too dusty that it gives me kind of wintry vibes, if that makes sense. I just think this one is so flattering. The next shade is Crocus, a purple linear holographic inspired by the first flowers that poke through the snow. So I think I would call this a deep but still muted blue toned purple, where it's not super bright and it has this almost steely kind of look to it, which I think is from the holographic sparkle, which I know you can't see, it doesn't pick up well under my desk lighting, because it is just super subtle even in the sun. But the formula was the same as the others, where it was a little bit sheer on the first coat but then fully opaque on the second. And I found that it does deepen and brighten the color up a little bit more as well, even though it does look a little bit brighter here on camera than how I see it in real life. This one was actually a surprise favorite for me because I think normally I would be drawn to a shade like this in the fall or winter, but I think it just works so well for this time of year, especially with the other shades in this collection. And rounding out the collection, we have Jeannie, a soft periwinkle blue inspired by one of Walker's oldest friends. So I think it's such a sweet thing to be named after a polish, especially for such a calming and beautiful shade as this one. It's probably my absolute favorite from this collection. It had the same easy to apply formula that built up to opacity in just 2 coats, and I just adore how it's the perfect mix of bright with a little bit of dusty. It's like a true periwinkle shade, which is definitely one of my absolute favorites, not just for the spring, but just in general. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be wearing my hoodie that matches this color exactly, and it's just so satisfying to me. Now moving on to comparisons, I have a ton for Scape, but I wanted to quickly show it next to Matcha from Cirque Colors, which just came out not too long ago, and it's definitely not a dupe. But for closer color comparisons, I had to show it next to a couple of Olive greens, like Terre from a previous fall collection, which might look a little similar, but it is a lot more dusty. And of course, I also have Sprout from last year's spring collection, which I think looks almost nearly identical in the bottle, but it is a little bit lighter and more of a yellow leaning leafy green. So once you see them on the nail, you can really tell these apart. They are completely different from each other, even though in the background you can see the bottles still look very similar to each other. They're actually not that similar at all, especially on the nail where I think it counts more. I also wanted to show how Scape compares to Holo Taco's Matcha Maker since it's discontinued, but sadly Matcha Maker isn't a dupe since it's not as yellow. I also have OPI's Clear Your Cache from their recent spring launch, and it's definitely similar vibes, but again, on the nail, they really show up so differently, where the OPI is even more yellow leaning and a little bit brighter as well. And the last 2 comparisons that I have are Orosa's Honeydew, which is another favorite green of mine that's kind of similar to Matcha Maker, but it's still just a little dusty and not as yellow. And I also have Cirque's Tumbleweed from a few summers ago, which is their avocado green cream. So this one was actually the closest shade that I would say is like a 99% match. So if you do have Tumbleweed, I don't think you would need to get Scape, but if you have neither, I would say Cirque's formula is a little bit creamier, but it does have a skinny brush, so I would just go with Scape. I just had a handful of comparisons for Amaryllis, starting with Blossom, which is kind of similar, but it's a little bit lighter, a lot more peachy, and also has a gold shimmer. I think a somewhat closer shade that I had to this was Color Department's Talk to Me, which I shared as one of my favorite pinks for Valentine's Day. And they definitely look super similar in the bottle, but on the nail, it's just a little darker or maybe a little bit dustier. So they're definitely pretty similar, but definitely not dupes. I also wanted to show this next to LA Colors Rose Quartz, which is one of my favorite baby pinks, and it might look nearly identical here in the bottle, but just hold your judgment. And the last pink I wanted to compare it to is actually one of the new ones from China Glaze's Hello Sugar collection, which I will be reviewing soon, but this ended up almost being like one of those bleached neons, if that makes sense. So it's just a lot brighter and more of that kind of whitened base to it. But yeah, the LA Colors shade is more of that true bright baby pink, almost like a cotton candy kind of pink, whereas Amaryllis is a little bit warmer. Next for Elwell, I only have Essie's Go Ginza to compare it to, which, as you can see, is a very loved shade in my collection. And while they aren't dupes, Go Ginza is definitely a very similar color where I would call them almost cousins. The main difference between them is that Elwell is lighter and a lot more sheer. I have 3 coats of it here compared to 2 on Essie, and it also has that pink shimmer, but I really love both of these. For Artie, I knew I had to show it next to Lilac, which is one of my favorite periwinkle purple kind of shades, but you can see next to this one, it's definitely a lot more blue leaning. So I also wanted to show it next to Zoya's Megan, which is another favorite of mine because on me, this shade has always towed the line between gray and lavender, or maybe not lavender, but just a really warm gray. But obviously here, it looks very neutral. So I'm almost unsure if maybe mine faded or if it's just the lighting or actual color theory that's making it look neutral. But yeah, these ended up not being dupes or even remotely close at all. Next up for Crocus, I have Olivav's Cactus Flower, which I know isn't even close to being a dupe, but they both have that similar, almost muted or dark gray undertone to them. But I thought that Mooncat's Antifragile would be more of a closer comparison since it's a very bright blue-toned purple linear holographic. But as you can see, the Mooncat shade is definitely super blinding with its holo, at least in the bottle here. So even though they look kind of similar in the bottle as far as the base color, on the nail you can see just how much darker the Mooncat shade is, where it really is closer to an indigo almost, or at least like a dark violet. So not dupes, but I thought then that maybe Mooncat's Shattered Glass would be a little similar since it's the lighter purple linear holo. So I definitely think these are really close color-wise at least. And the last shade that I remembered was A. England's Elizabeth, which I reviewed a couple of months ago, and I was so shocked at how spot on these were color-wise. So on the nail, you can definitely see the similarities between all 3 of them. The main difference really is the formulas in terms of coverage. I would say that Crocus is the thinnest or sheerest formula, but they're still completely opaque in 2 coats. And the other glaring difference is the holo, where Mooncat's is definitely the strongest, and then Crocus is the weakest, with A. England being a little bit in between. And lastly for Jeannie, I wanted to quickly show Cloudy next to it because that's the very, very pale sky blue kind of shade, but I feel like next to Jeannie, it just kind of looks white. You do get a hint of blue though, but definitely not similar. But the closer color comparison that I have is Olivav's Cornflower, which is a pretty standard periwinkle cornflower blue type of shade, but a lot darker. And I also wanted to show this one next to Lilac, which I would call a periwinkle but purple kind of shade. I know that periwinkle's one of those weird in-between colors that can definitely lean either blue or purple, so I feel like these 2 represent that so well. And here is Artie next to these 2, which is a lot more purple, so Lilac is pretty much that true in-between shade, but these make such a perfect gradient. But on the nail, I wanted to show Cornflower and Lilac next to Jeannie since I think these 2 are more of the similar, like, next shade over, if that makes sense, but definitely not dupes. So that wraps up my swatches and comparisons for Olivav's new Equinox collection. As always, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this release because generally I definitely am a fan of these. As you saw, I had a pretty good amount of comparisons for most of these polishes, so I just tend to gravitate towards these shades, especially for spring. So I really do like them, and I think the formula was still really good, even though it wasn't some of the expected full coverage, creamy, opaque in 1 coat formulas that we've gotten from Olivav before. They still were opaque in 2, so I'm not complaining about that. But I can also see how some people might not really be a fan of the fact that this color palette isn't exactly new. A lot of these shades, as you saw, were pretty similar to existing Olivav polishes. Even though they were definitely not dupes of each other, they were just subtly different. And I think there's definitely a certain amount of people that might be like, that's kind of boring to me. Like, I want new shades. And there's definitely a little part of me that does agree with that. I always love a new, fun, fresh palette. And I think Walker does tend to release very similar shades or like different iterations of shades she already has. But as far as these go, I'm definitely not upset about them because, again, I just gravitate towards these shades or any kind of iteration of them. And I think it just provides more options for people too. So my perfect example for this collection is Scape, where normally Sprout was kind of like my go-to spring light pastel green, but it was a little yellow, right? Like, and I'm not really a fan of yellow leaning greens. It's just my preference, and Scape is like the perfect green for me, like there's still a brightness, a little bit of yellow to it, but it's not as yellow as Sprout. So for me, I love that we have Scape. Or even with Jeannie, for example, like this matches my hoodie perfectly. And this is like one of my favorite colors. Like I have a tumbler in this color. And before having Jeannie, I would have said my go-to favorite was Lilac, which I still really think is an absolutely beautiful shade. But as far as like that true kind of like periwinkle sort of color, the closest one that we had was Cornflower, but that one was like pretty dark, So I really love having Jeannie in this lineup and having this like perfect periwinkle. So it might be kind of silly, but for someone like me who's just annoyingly picky about color preferences and whatnot, I think it is really great to have these different options. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below so we can chat about it. But thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.